So our next presentation, before he comes to the stage, I just want to tell you from my personal point of view. The first time I went to Tsitsanakaberg in Yerevan, the Armenian Genocide Memorial and Museum, I really didn't know what to expect. Obviously, going to see the eternal flame, that was important, was very emotional. I didn't really think about the museum. When I went into the museum, I was amazed at how so much material that I hadn't known about was displayed. And not only that, the person who was making these displays possible, bringing this information out, cataloging it, was Dr. Haig Demoyan. Dr. Demoyan not only runs the museum, he is a historian in his own right, and he has a passionate belief that in the run-up to not just to 2015, but beyond, how important it is to make these materials known not only to Armenians, but to the world. There's a wealth of photographic material, documents, that wealth is in Armenia. And so, with great pleasure, I introduce you to Dr. Haig Demoyan and his presentation, which is about somebody we know, we've heard a little bit about. You heard the name Arshakos Mardikian. That person is Aurora Mardikian, or as some of you may know her, Aurora Mardiganian.
Ladies and gentlemen, 20 years ago, back in January 1994, she was here in Ararat. She passed away very close. There is a Providence Hospital here in early February 1994. So what I want to ask you before I start my presentation, and in the name of Aurora, Eskijian, and the others, missionaries, survivors, relief workers, please stand up to respect their memories in 1 minute silence. Thank you very much. The story I'm going to tell you, it's part of my researches. Currently, Armenian Genocide Museum is under construction. We expanded its existing building 2.5 times. We added new blocks, new facilities, new research rooms, and compared with the former exhibition, which now gone, we cleaned everything. A new one will be opened in April 24, 2015, will display 200 times more materials. So this is really challenging, and currently we are working on a technologically and conceptually new exhibition. This will be something different. Deep, academic, and no questions, and no denial possible inside of the walls of museum and probably outside. The story I'm going to tell you is really attractive. This is the story of human bravery. It's a story of winner rather than loser. This is a story which could be a visit card of a nation to show how the daughter of nation can be so brave in order to repeat the old story happened with her and tragedy, but with the understanding that this is important. This is important for relief. This is important for Armenian orphans. So this is one of my interests currently I'm working in, and I was successful to track down amazing new material I'm going to share with you right now. Aurora Mardiganian, and why we Armenians and the world forgot about her heroic deeds, and why in this country, when 1919, Aurora's name was on the mouth of every American, it was shown, movie was shown in 23 states, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Great Britain, in Europe, in Australia, and once everyone know nothing about her. So I'm going to bring my analysis why it happened. Maybe this could be some part of provocation, but you may ask me questions about my judgments and analysis. Well, not this one. Yeah, Aurora Mardiganian, she was born in Chemeshkatsak village, which is very close to Kharpet in western Armenia. Here in a unique photo, this is original, we have in our collection, and thank you to Vivian Jamharian and Karol Karabashian. They agreed to donate part of archive of Aurora Mardiganian, surprisingly survived. So in the corner, left corner, you will see Aurora, 2 years old, Aurora Mardiganian. Mostly family members were killed, and a lot of stories already told by previous presenters. I don't want to go deep in a book to tell what happened, but rather to explain other unknown stories around this. So this is, fortunately, we have, well, this is Chemeshkatsak village, where she was born in 1901. In her late interviews, she describes a lot about the village, about the surroundings, geography, and if we look, this is quarter where Aurora was born. Actually, we track based on this interview. This is Chemeshkatsak in our days, aerial view, and what we found while browsing the internet. Very interesting graffitis in caves, probably from Urartian period. And you see a lot of graffitis in Armenian. The last dated graffiti is dated 1914. So still it's possible to find these graffitis. This is geography. The route of Aurora from Chemeshkatsak until Kars and Tivlis and later to St. Petersburg. A person who brought Aurora in this country is a Canadian missionary, Frederick Muckle. The last part of the book she describes, and she's very thankful to this missionary who brought Aurora to the United States. This is the house of Hojhannes Eskijian, famous writer. In her late interview, she identified the house of Zoravar Andranik she stayed in while in Tiflis. And we made a lot of research, and we find out that Andranik usually stayed at Hojhannes Eskijian's house in Tiflis. It was autumn 1917. She was on the way to St. Petersburg. That one, the city was renamed Petrograd that time, and it was a really big turmoil in this city. You know, the temporary government, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and she described in the following way in the interview. There was a street fighting, a lot of people were killed in front of her eyes, and she survived somehow. She stayed in a church and spent some starving days there, and she said, "Oh God, we survived the Turkish brutalities, now we are in this city and we could be easily killed." And somehow she survived, and she was taken to Oslo through Finland. And from Oslo we identified 2 ocean liners, possibly one called Oscar. It's interesting. Oscar took her to the United States. You know the story that Aurora's interview, after interview, a book, very limited edition of that book was printed in 1918. And the cover photo you see, fortunately, we have one copy, original copy, in a museum, but as far as we know, in many libraries, there are not many libraries having the exact number of copies of this book. But the later editions, 1919, 1920 editions, were selling 500,000 copies. It was so popular that the book started with advertisements, a lot of commercial advertisements, and the book ended with commercial advertisements. We have copied. That's why the book was so important. Even in Holland, the book was named as the Book of the Year. Again, from the movie. Famous actors of that time, Irving Cummings, Anna Nielsen, Asian Basinger, they starred different roles in the movie. You know this guy, Henry Morgenthau. It was recorded that Henry Morgenthau starred his own role. He played as a role of American ambassador in a movie. So you know that only 18 minutes of movie survived because it was made on 13 reels and 3,000 people participated in a screening, in a shooting of the movie. So Morgenthau played in a movie. It was questionable, is it right or not? Until recently. In Armenian archives, in January this year, it was possible to find another copy of the movie with the Morgenthau in it. It is 1.5 minutes extra of the survival part we had and used within last 20 years. So at least you will have a chance to see this half-minute footage with the meeting of young Turkish leaders and Morgenthau visiting them and protesting. It's the beginning of the movie. You see Enver Pasha, Talat, Wangenheim, then announcement that American ambassador visits, you can see. And then Sultan. This part was considered as lost. Sultan. A moment as they. Thank you. Going back to the slides. Well, if you keep searching, you will find definitely. This is the motto of many people, not of us, but well, it's going back. Yeah, some photos from the other part of the movie also, you can see it as a loss. This is a set of killing of family members in the house. We have no video, no even photos from this part of the movie. Now we have that part also in the movie recently found. The way we found and how we track it down, I will tell you a little later. Again, arts. You know the story that Aurora, the mothers put them in pits and covered with the soil when Turks were searching pretty ladies in the nighttime. So it was impossible for them to take them for rape. How professionally was made that movie? It's amazing. For 1918, it is something. The way, the technology, the way of approaching. By the way, Aurora also played a crucial role, being consultant. She consulted what kind of dress to wear, how to behave. So she was not an actress, but also consultant for this movie. And look at the altar and the Armenian bishops. It looks like a real documentary. Really, everything is carefully done here. A lot of memorabilia survives because from that time, made in many places, in United States, in United Kingdom. We had even a Cuban magazine actually, with the front page of Aurora. The poster, please remember this poster. This is the main colored poster of the movie Ravished Armenia. The movie has two different names, but at the last moment they decided to fix on an Auction of Souls, which is really very melodramatic and bringing a lot of attraction. Please remember this poster, because at the end we'll back to this, what is depicted here. Another poster. Well, for the first poster, I would like to say thank you to John and Marian Barsumian. 3 days ago, they agreed to donate to the permanent exhibition of our museum the original poster. The first screening happened in Alexandria Hotel. Here, Mayor of Los Angeles, Woodman, sponsored that event, and Aurora also. She was ill at that time, but she joined the event later. Woodman, you can see. And a lot of media clips, proclamations. She met with a lot of known people that time, both in this part of the United States and in New York. She was in the epicenter of the Americas. A lot of people wanted to meet with her. Armenian community was excited, very excited. And as she confessed later in one of interviews shot by Michael Hagopian, she said that a cousin of Woodrow Wilson offered to marry with him. It's interesting. But she rejected. She said, no, I don't want to marry with Oda. I want to marry and make a family with Armenian. Well, this could be missed opportunity, but it was scheduled also to meet with the President Wilson, but at the end, even they trained Aurora how to be there, what kind of expressions to use, what kind of words, etc. But at the last moment, that meeting was cancelled for no reason. Los Angeles Examiner heavily covered the story, the geography of the reprints from the book. The whole book was printed in Winnipeg Press, in Canadian newspapers, in American newspapers. And you see whole newspapers pages were dedicated to that story. Some articles were accompanied by graphical drawings. And for example, in the Winnipeg Press, the continued of publications represent like a graphical novel. So much graphical designs were attached. Again, from the newspapers. In 1990, we found more than 1,000 newspapers, American newspapers, from Honolulu, Hawaii, to other states, with advertisements about the movie. In some advertisements, you will read adults only admitted. There are also special screenings for women, early morning screenings. There are some photos survived when the people lined, and some people even were in protest because of missing. You can see newspaper last page and the Auction of Souls advertisements here. This was typical for many newspapers to show in this way. In New York, the movie was screened in February 1919. A lot of prominent people from New York joined that event, and it happened in Plaza Hotel's ballroom in New York. There were several photo sessions in Hollywood, and Aurora posed like an Armenian national costume. There are 7 shots like this with this head cover, and you can see banners of the Auction of Souls from Motion Picture Magazine, heavily covered that time, motion picture magazines about the Auction of Souls. And you can see interesting picture. It says, disappointed crowds unable to get into midnight matinee. So people were just waiting for tickets there. Again, this is publication from the another movie magazine with a sense of crucifixion. There were also protests, of course, excitements, but also protests from society saying this is too much. This is really gruesome to show this kind of stories in a natural way. But you know, the story that the American News Relief ordered this movie in order to use it for fundraising purposes. The target was 30 million, and the American News Relief mentioned on posters as an organization which ordered that movie. Aurora, one of Aurora's pictures, Armenian made. This music was made and dedicated to Aurora. The notes it's possible to find. Sometimes on eBay you can find this. It's very interesting. 1920 music and with dedication text of Aurora and her message also attached here. This is Carteles, possibly Kubayan magazine with the front page of Aurora. In Boston, it was screened in a Strand movie theater. I was there in Boston. It was too cold to compare with California. Yeah, but I found this unchanged. The building is the same. It was inaugurated in 1918, so on the next year, or auction of souls was screened here. Another place, the Boston Symphony Hall. He also several screenings occurred, and Aurora also was there. The Boston newspaper advertisements. And you can see Boston Globe newspaper and the names of the prominent people from the city who joined that event. This very important person, Charles Ariel, person who made Harvard, who created Harvard being 40 years president of Harvard. He joined also this screening, and what we found a letter dated to 4 February 1919, Cambridge, and it says, he sent a letter to the persons who made this movie. I just want to quote, it's very interesting to quote this letter because for that time it was something. Quote, "The sight of this motion picture is capable of implanting in many millions of thinking Americans three convictions which may reasonably determine the public conduct of the American people in the near future. First, that the American people deserve to be rescued, comforted, and made free and secure for the future by the use of the full power of the democratic Western peoples. Secondly, that the Council of Europe, which since the Crimean War at least has seemingly failed to protect the Christian population of the Near East and to establish justice in that part of the world, should now be replaced by more effective international organization." Remember, this is 1990. And thirdly, that if this enterprise of restoring Armenia be a crusade, that is an enterprise undertaken in a good cause with unselfish enthusiasm, it is a crusade in which the American people should ardently desire to take part. So this is Charles Eliot. Okay, that was later. One of the photos revealed recently in Boston Archives, Armenian organization, Aurora, Mardi Gras, shortly after the screening in Boston. Its original photo. There were 3 shots, and Winnipeg Tribune. Look at the text just under the title of the newspaper. Exposure of the Turk atrocities is auction of souls. I would say that this year in September 20 in Winnipeg, a big museum, Canadian Museum for Human Rights, will be inaugurated. So we signed an agreement with the museum for cooperation, and part of this museum, is a huge museum, will be dedicated to Armenian genocide. And particularly since Winnipeg also has some connection with Aurora story, and in Winnipeg movie theaters, Auction of Souls was screened. So in the museum also we suggested to include the story about Aurora Mardi Gras and Auction of Souls. Moving geography, Great Britain. It was an unprecedented story with Odyssey of Auction of Souls in the United Kingdom. It was strict resistance to show that movie because of fear that this could trigger reaction among Muslim population, especially in the Muslim colonies or the British colonies. What you see now, this is the front cover of London edition of Auction of Souls, actually Revised Armenian, book of Revised Armenian. It was shortened, it was censored, so there were some parts taken out, both from the book and the movie. And the movie was under danger because Scotland Yard opposed, and not only Scotland Yard, but the party which is censoring the movies, they resisted to show this in London. But at the last moment, very interesting organization called League of Nations protested, and the movie was screened in Queen's Plaza and Albert Hall in conjunction with, look at this advertisement of the movie, adults only admitted, in conjunction with League of Nations. So League of Nations in some way sponsored the screening of Auction of Souls in Great Britain. Well, this beautiful stuff we recently obtained from the auction. It says Pump Room, it's a hotel in London, and it's exactly as shown at the Royal Albert Hall. This is original poster, colored poster, which is part of our collection of Genocide Museum. British newspapers also heavily covered this story, and Katya Petlekian recently published British media outlets about Armenian genocide. Among them also there are some outlets, Auction of Souls and Ararat-Eskijian. This is another copy of the Revised Armenian, printed in 1919 in New York, with a lot of photos from the movie. This is a very valuable edition because there are some photos and the pictures from the movie. Well, this is something new, and I was amazed to find out that Revised Armenian was not printed only in English. That time, in 1920. So we have now the title which says in Polish, the killings of Armenians, Christians, Armenian Christians. It was printed in Toledo, Ohio. It is in Polish, 1920. So we have any idea about this, that the Revised Armenian book was printed, translated into Polish and printed here in the United States. But this is not all. Look at this. Revised Armenia in 1920 was printed in Dutch, in Holland. Moreover, we have the original copy, and thank you to Nikolai Romashuk, who donated from his personal library this book. And what is this? This is original booklet of movie company which owned the rights of screening Auction of Souls in Holland. The police commissioner in Hague banned the screening of the movie. For some reason that this could trigger disturbances among the population and the Muslims. But in other places it was screened. We know for sure that the movie was screened in France, in Marseille, and during the international fair in Holland. But the case of Holland is very interesting. When all the world forgot about Aurora back in 1940s and 50s, can you imagine in 1957, again, the Revised Armenian was printed in Holland. So this is the cover of that edition. There are some new editions of 2003 and 2008, but this is 1957. Very interesting newspaper. This is Dutch newspaper, Limburg Dagblad, and the first front page, it's 5 columns, and it's titled "The Shame of Christian Europe." All the article is dedicated to Ararat-Eskijian and movie Auction of Souls. Another geography, Australia. This is from Australian newspaper, advertisement of Auction of Souls. Another one. Now, what is this? 3 ladies, they look like Oriental ladies, covered, walking in the streets of Sydney, Australia. This is 1920. The second, please. So this is a rare chance to see 30-second movie, silent movie. These ladies, dressed like Armenians, Oriental ladies, this is live advertisement of Auction of Souls in Sydney. Thank you. Back again to the slides. So we can imagine that how popular was that movie in 1919, 1920. So the main question, why? We have no any idea. And the board forgot about this. I remember that this is the title of my presentation. So I will be back to that. Yes, you can see kangaroos, the text combining this 30-second footage. Some photos of Aurora's wedding. This first time we show thanks to the Aurora's cousins who kindly donated. Those archives survived somehow in their house. It's 1929 photo of Aurora Mardiganian. She married with Armenian, by the way. Yeah. It's shortly after marriage, 1929 photo. The Oscar Apfel, who made the movie Auction of Souls, he said, no makeup, no makeup. Your natural beauty is okay for the movie. With the son Martin, after graduation. That's beautiful, huh? Greeting card. This is a picture from the last interview of Aurora. It was done by Zorian Institute, and thank you to Zorian Institute for providing a 3 hours long interview recently. It was interesting to reveal new materials and to hear her voice, once silenced 20 years ago. We have 4-minute footage from that interview. I want her voice to be heard here. And she will explain why her name was changed from Arshalus Olgania to Aurora Mardiganian. The interviewer is my colleague Ruben Adalia, back in 1984.
Do you know what I'm Urdu now? Mardiganian is not there.
Well, my Hojhannes Eskijian.
Hello, another Mardiganian. Whatever Mardiganian can say. Urdu there are also Michu Mardiganian.
Michu Mardiganian. Vorbesc în aire unde ferenaidan. Mardiganian. Vecerele Mardigia.
Deci am avut un interviu la
Well, Mardiganian vecerele clasi nearest service officer vor să fim anunăs podarandan. Să nu. Este o daranicianile, să fim bazătinul de camere chiar despre roșme podaranul e haie. Ese hayvanın çıktığı korzada esbacın tutulursa. Hatta tuttu. Zaten şansı sande sakızım. Maydanın istermi. Çem zeymanın spoket. Madanın spoket. Madanın Mardiganian. İn bazı sene Mardiganian kadar Mardigan, Jewish Kazakh Salak. Yes, एक Mardiganian, Odaran Chances, or I all the look again, in Panama, Hachotor Rangaji, or the Chudete Apodaran. Kathleen, a samurai. The Poland Army, Ebu Kiyonia, Anna Magani, Zanza Magadusan Mardigan. So, Mardiganian to them, into Mardiganian to them. Go there are Darunagi, no chance, a support together, Scuba Veterans, Ashwarati, Sarasi, still not the Darasi. Yet that is never, Chinese were not there, the Runakun Dada Afghanistan woman, Merat, and some woman, Kabin Chesky, in Chile, the little nation is enormous. So, I got a child of gun to get them that I don't believe someone has been I was able to hear nothing was So, Adiga good kid listening for America Nation last and Mardiganian. Yes, Naif Abo was last nation cooking 17 at this A.M. Mardiganian.
Czemuż Kazagien hiçbir şey.
Czemuż Kazagien even television was
This is another photo exactly posed in the way as she was depicted on the front page of the first edition of Revised Armenia book. When killing, assassination of John Kennedy occurred in Dallas in 1963, Aurora Mardiganian wrote a letter to Jacqueline Kennedy. She sent even a copy of Revised Armenia to Jacqueline Kennedy. And in a letter, she tried to explain her own story, trying to understand what happened with Jacqueline and what psychological mood she is. It's a very interesting letter, and if you allow, I can just read out of it. As a person who has felt pain and sorrow and experienced unfortunes throughout her life, I am donating a small amount to the foundation of the John F. Kennedy Library. If you have read my story, Auction of Souls, which you have received as a gift, you will understand what I am trying to express. I regret that as of yet I have not had the opportunity to meet you personally. I hope that someday I will have the pleasure to discuss in person the meaning of my book and the sorrow we have both encountered. This was the reply to that letter from the secretaries of the Jacqueline Kennedy. Before that, I want to explain who is this guy. His name is Hojhannes Eskijian. Back in 1938, his friend in Marsilia, while cleaning his garage, offered a reel. He said something about Armenians, and it's titled like Martyr Nation. And he showed that movie. Eskijian said, yes, I'm okay. He said, I want to buy it. So he bought that reel. And that reel is the only survived part of the Revised Armenia Auction of Souls. Eskijian, his amateur movie maker, sent a copy to Soviet Armenia in 1930s. The exact copy we use now. But it was, of course, confiscated by KGB that time. And the second copy, fortunately he kept the copy. Second copy he brought with him while repatriating to Soviet Armenia in 40s. Now, after the independence, we asked a lot of movies and documentaries, silent movies from Moscow. And our Armenian archives got a copy, exactly the copy which was confiscated by KGB. And that copy contained 1.5 times more, 1.5 minutes more footage. And we found and tracked it in January this year. Why it was not known? Because it was under a different title. It was titled as Der Zor, and no one were aware that this is really Auction of Souls. So because thanks to this gentleman, we have that part survived. His name is Yervant Setian. Don't be surprised. Now, why forgetting Aurora? Why forgetting Auction of Souls, the legacy and the message sent by Nearest Relief? While working on the papers and with the text, I find out that we can identify at least two waves of oblivion, two waves of intentional forgetfulness. The first wave happened back in 1920s. No one needed Aurora Mardiganian and the story of Auction of Souls. World politics changed, and many recalculations happened. So, in a global term, amelioration of relations between former enemies also played a crucial role to cover up this story. There are a lot of question marks. Why the copy of the book survived in a couple of libraries in the world, in this country too? Why we lost the original movie once shown in many parts of the world? Why James Barton, author of Story of Nearest Relief, who published this book in 1930, dedicated a couple of pages on movies sponsored by Nearest Relief, there's not any single line about the world-known movie called Auction of Souls. Big question. Why? Because the Nearest Relief Foundation ordered that movie, and they used that for relief purposes. But no single line, all the movies are mentioned there. It's a good question. Now, the first wave of forgetting also has some community relations. Aurora, while communicating with Armenian sportsman Varan Papazian, this is sportsman, not famous dramaturg. Varan Papazian found her and they communicated, and Aurora said, some people threatened me, they called me, they started interrogation and threatening him permanently. So what could be in the base of this threatening from the community? I checked some newspapers of that time. Although some Armenian newspapers put the advertisement about the screening. After screening, many editorials said that this is a bad movie. The reason is that it shows that Armenians are victims. They are like a sheep who went to be killed. And there are no any show of brave self-defense and fighting, etc. This was the main reason. And it was, in one of the editorials, it was said, go and see that shameful picture, which shows how they treated us, but not how we resisted and defended ourselves. So one of the reasons was not to show this film, although this film was for relief purposes. But it was also the matter of honor for some circles. So second wave of strike to these memories probably happened in early 30s, 10, 12 years after of popularity of Aurora Mardiganian and Auction of Souls. And why I showed this picture? While on the way to US, I read this very interesting research authored by Ben Urwand called The Collaboration, Hollywood's Pact with Hitler. Many studios in Hollywood were under heavy control of Nazis. And the German ambassador, his name was Georg Giesling, he even personally threatened many movie workers of Hollywood. Hollywood studios were in deal with Nazi Germany because the German market was more preferable. a lot of movies were sold to the German market. This gentleman, who was appointed as a counselor in LA, counselor of Nazi Germany, he personally censored many movies made in Hollywood. Nazis were very sensitive to the movies depicting First World War. And even they protested, they banned the showing of the movies showing Germany and his allies in a bad way. So, even German chancellor, I'm repeating again, he censored and he threatened maybe many movie workers here in this part of the US. Cut this one, remove this one, or you are not allowed to play in that or make that movie. Hollywood studios were under heavy pressure. But it was a deal. So I strongly recommend to read this. But again, maybe this sounds like a provocation. But what could be a link between ravished Armenian auction souls, Aurora Mardiganian, First World War, and Nazis? This is a poster from the First World War. There's a wonderful article analysis on a Grung on the picture and the content of this poster. It shows the German military and the civilization and the German culture is like a big stick. But if you see this comparison, look at these posters. First World War. Auction of Souls was the First World War movie. In a book which was censored, there is a part of the rape of Aurora and her girlfriends by German officials, who even shot some of the Armenian girls. So it's very possible, it's not an exaggeration, that even this movie was targeted by Nazis and the Consular General of Nazi Germany in California, because this is First World War anti-German poster, and that one also depicting the same content or nearly the same content. Coming to the end, the legacy of Aurora. Once silenced, we have to reveal, to dig out the legacy of Aurora, because this story is encyclopedia of Armenian genocide. You will find many, many things. And if you single out this story, you can single out a lot of stories from Armenian genocide story. But one story is enough to explain a lot of things, what happened with Armenians. But this is also a women's story, this is American history, this is Armenian history, this is movie history, this is history of heroine, once called Armenian Jeanne d'Arc. This is Russian translation. We had a wonderful presentation of Russian edition of the book in Moscow last year. Soon it will be translated by the efforts of Armenian Genocide Museum as a part of continuity of Aurora's mission in many other languages. Epilogue. Before going to epilogue, I would like to say thank you once again to Vivian Janharyan, Nicola Romashuk, Didier Babiganyan, who provided me Australian footage, Shan Mardirosyan, Maggie Goshin for her help, Anthony Swart, Armen Khanjan, and others. The epilogue is following. You remember that first screening of Auction of Souls in New York occurred in Plaza Hotel. Here, Aurora explained why she is in New York, in America. She said, when Turks made these sharp sticks, it was crucifixion sign. She explained that this is more civilized way American movie makers made. They said when they made these sharp crosses to put girls on, they miscalculated. That's why I am here. Last year, Armenian Post Office issued this wonderful stamp depicting Aurora and ravished Armenia. But the story repeats itself. I tried hard to explain people who is Aurora Mardiganian. They have not any idea. They said, why? We don't know this story. We don't know this girl. Why we have to issue official stamp? I explained, I was really nearly to shout on every them to explain that it's very important. While voting, the chairman mixed up the votes. So, and there was one voice missing to get yes for issuance. And one voice they miscalculated. And because of that, this stamp was issued. Thank you very much for your attention.
The organizers of this event that it's an appropriate moment in the day to have a moment of peace and reflection. And what better than to hear some music? And the person who will be performing for us, Dr. Vache Mankarian, is himself a man of letters. We can call him doctor now. He just got his degree from the USC Thornton School of Music, and he's written many books and monographs on Armenian culture. So I'm not going to say any more. I'll just invite him to the stage, Dr. Vache Mankarian.
Perhaps no other name epitomizes the victims of April 24 as much as Gomidas. Gomidas did not suffer the fate of his compatriots. He was saved by intervention of influential officials. However, he suffered a fate far worse than death. On his return from exile, he found his home ransacked and his community destroyed. This, coupled with the loss of his friends and his entire life's work, proved too much to bear for this sensitive artist. Gomidas suffered a breakdown, and from 1915 until his death in 1935, he lived in a French sanitarium in complete mental darkness, suffering from incessant nightmarish hallucinations. Gomidas was born in Gulenia, a city in the Ottoman Empire, where speaking the Armenian language was forbidden. As a result, he was unable to speak Armenian when he arrived in Echmiadzin as a preteen. However, not only did he master his mother tongue, but he went on to become the father of Armenian professional music. It is impossible to summarize Gomidas' luminous life work in a couple of minutes. However, his work, that which survived the genocide, not only became a salve for survivors all over the globe, but also an inspiration for musicians of my generation. It remains a connection to the land where it was created, but which was taken from our grandparents. Reading the lyrics to the folk songs that Gomidas preserved and notated, we experience a scope of emotions, from the sheer and immaculate joy to their deepest and darkest sorrow. In a single word, the entire history of the Armenian people is present within these simple yet profound songs. In my opinion, Gomidas' music nowadays is not performed as much as it should be. Perhaps in 5 years, a conference must be organized to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Gomidas' birth and to present a complete retrospective of his music. I'm grateful that Maggie Mangasaryan-Goshen has invited me to present a short musical program for today's conference dedicated to the music of Gomidas. I have attended many such conferences, been part of the organizing committee of a few. However, this is the first time that I have been invited to participate. Therefore, I thank Maggie for reaffirming that music is an integral part of Armenian culture. Also, today we witnessed the unveiling of a dress and a rug from my paternal ancestral town of Hojhan. My grandfather was forced to flee Hojhan, where the Mankarians represented an ancient family. In Robert Hewson's Book of Maps, one can find a map of Hojhan, where a river and an entire section of the upper part of the town were named after the Mankarian family. Of the some 300 Mankarians who lived in Hojhan, only 3 survived the genocide. I have not seen Hojhan. My father did not get a chance to see Hojhan. However, it is through the folk music of our ancestors, which Gomidas saved, that I'm able to connect with my ancestral past. Utilizing his transcriptions of these songs as the basis for my own compositions remedies the yearning to see my ancestral land and provides hope that one day the music that was played on that land, where it originated over 3,000 years ago, will once again be played there. I would like to perform two of my compositions, both of which are based on melodic themes of folk songs transcribed by Gomidas. The first is titled Poem for Gomidas, and the second is a suite of 4 songs after Gomidas.
Wonderful. Doesn't that remind us who we are? Reminds me who Armenians are. I'd like to announce now, we have some special guests who joined us for this conference. I'd like to welcome Governor George Dugmajan, who's I'd like to welcome Michael Soroy, Honorary Consul of Norway in Los Angeles, who's joined us. Athena Plakoudi, Assistant Consul General of Greece, is here. And Ms. Karen Lanyon, Consul General of Australia. She is here joining us. And we are also joined by Vivian Lusararian, who is the second cousin of Aurora Mardiganian. Would you please stand? So a few changes in the program. Unfortunately, Professor Dadrian could not join us, so we will not have the pleasure of his company today. We're also going to move the question and answer period up to after Robert Fisk's presentation. So if you have any questions about Dr. De Moyen's presentation, please be thinking about those, writing those on your cards, and those cards are floating around. And just after Dr. Robert Fisk's presentation, we'll have the question and answer, and then we'll have the film clip, and then we'll have the awards presentation. So to introduce Robert Fisk, I'm very happy to invite back onto the stage Misat Kalishan. Misa.
How could you introduce Robert? Robert Fisk, Middle East correspondent, the London Independent, and has been stationed in Beirut for the last 38 years. He interviewed Bin Laden 3 times. He reported from Northern Ireland in the 70s, Portuguese Revolution, Lebanese War, Iranian Revolution, Soviet War in Afghanistan, Iran-Iraq War, Gulf War, Bosnian War, Algerian Civil War, Kosovo, 2001 international intervention in Afghanistan, Arab Spring, and ongoing civil war in Syria. For 5 days he didn't respond to my calls, no text, no email, nothing. Thursday evening, he calls me. He says, I'm coming. And I am in Syria. I am in Yabrud. By the way, Yabrud is the latest town which fell from the hands of the rebels, and the Syrian government took that town back. And he flew directly from Damascus and arrived at LAX yesterday. He has spoken about the Armenian genocide many, many times. But something unique he did in 2007. When Hrant Dink, the Armenian journalist, was assassinated in Istanbul, he used the use of violence to silence the voice of freedom, he called it, by calling Hrant Dink assassination an addition to the 1,500,000 victims of 1915. Robert Fisk brings the static figure of the victims of the genocide into the light of the 21st century and makes it relevant to here and now. He shows us that the silenced genocide, intellectual, psychological, cultural, still continues, while others are digging in historical books trying to negate what happened April 24, 1915. I quote him, "Neutral reporting can be a dangerous myth." Is it Holocaust or tragedy? In the face of Turkish denial of Armenian genocide, Robert Fisk, an ardent investigative reporter who always stands tall and reports with courage and integrity, has been very busy about finding the truth about the Armenians and giving the Armenian people their dignity back. He lives in the constant danger, yet he carries on his work with grace, humility, and fortitude. He has been the strongest voice of freedom and human rights issues in the Middle East, from Lebanon to Syria, Iraq to Afghanistan, Israel to Iran, and from Turkey to Armenia. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Kish.
That was my new public relations. Those of you who came to listen to me last night, there'll be a certain amount of repetition now. But I'm a little bit wider awake than I was then. In fact, I began to feel quite aged last night when I was talking. It reminds me of when I went to interview Sheikh Asir, the very prominent Sunni Muslim fundamentalist inside the south of Beirut, not long ago before he went on the run from the Lebanese army. And I returned home with a quite good interview, not an unfunny one. It turned out that his father was a nightclub singer who had converted to becoming his local muezzin. No. And I got home and I wrote my story about Sheikh Asir and all he said. And I always check over afterwards and run my eye down my copy to make sure that I haven't said something I didn't mean. And I noticed I referred to him as the elderly bearded sheikh. And then I thought, hang on a minute, he's 2 years younger than me. So I went back and changed elderly to middle-aged. So don't believe everything you read in the press, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I have just come. Actually, I didn't fly from Damascus. I drove from Dabrud to Damascus, and then drove to Beirut, and then flew to Paris, and then flew to LAX, where I had the pleasure of 4 hours of immigration and border control. I really enjoy border security. I thought I might begin by giving you an idea of what life is like in Syria at the moment, from the front line, if you like, which is literally where I've come from. And in fact, the area of Yabrud, where I was present, where there was a lot of shelling and sniper fire and fighting. No dead bodies by the time I got to the town, but an awful lot of dead animals and an awful lot of damage. This, of course, is not many miles from the scene of the death marches and the killing fields of the Armenians, something I was very conscious of when I was in the town, because Islamists had held this town for 3 years, and I wanted to see what had happened to the oldest Christian church in Syria, which was in the town. I arrived in there to find thousands of Syrian government troops and many hundreds of Lebanese Hezbollah. Oddly enough, they seem to be semi-independent of each other. They obviously were sharing food and talking, but they preferred to have Hezbollah, who, by the way, had better uniforms, better equipment, better rifles, and better radios than the Syrian government army. They were sort of separate from each other. Oddly enough, I actually knew one of the Hezbollah, who smiled and walked up to me and said, "Hello, Mr. Robert." So it was that kind of occasion. I did manage to find, there were very few civilians left. I did manage to find a very nice middle-aged Muslim woman with a little boy of 13 months, who of course had lived his entire life under the Islamists in this town. She lived in a lovely Ottoman house, so old, and in fact so old with the traditions that her cows were kept in the basement of the house, so while you were chatting to her and drinking tea, the whole place smelled of cow dung. But she told a rather distressing story, that it was the Islamists who were selling food to the civilians left in the town. And they forced the Christians to pay more for the food than the Muslims, because they reimposed the dhimma, the tax, upon the Muslims in the Caliphate. Another very distressing element was that most of the food, she said, that was sold to them was UN humanitarian supplies given to refugees in Lebanon. Presumably these were supplies given to the Sunni Muslim supporters of the rebels in the town of Ersal, which is just over the other side of the Lebanese border from Yabrud, where we were. Interesting sort of connections there. I did find eventually the Church of the Holy Lady. In fact, there were still Roman columns in the bottom, just the broken off Roman columns in the bottom of the church. But what a state it was in. The cross on the top of the church had been smashed off, possibly by Syrian shell fire during the fighting. Much more distressing, however, was to find that as you walked into the courtyard of the church, the mosaics of saints around the wall, in every case, they had hammered out the eyes of the saints. There was even a giant mosaic of St. George and the Dragon. And they had hammered out the eyes of St. George and even the eyes of the poor old dragon. Outside the church was a pile of burned Bibles. And it occurred to me, I have to say, of course, at the time there was an awful lot of shells wanging around, but I did remember I was going to be talking to you today. So I picked up one of the Bibles. This, after all, is part of the great exodus of the Christians from the Middle East. In a sense, it's part of the story that started with the Armenian Christians of the Ottoman Empire. And I brought the remains of that burned Bible to show you today, because this is from the front line. This is the real thing. I'm afraid it's flaking to pieces as I take it out of here. That's the Bible left in the Church of the Holy Lady. This is the real thing. I picked this up from the floor of that church with gunfire going around this Monday morning. Then I went inside it. I'm afraid you can see it's actually flaking away as I hold it. Then I went inside the church and found that the beautiful gold paintings of the saints inside had been ripped off the walls, and with knives they had been systematically slashed and slashed and slashed in long strips. And where I was talking to you today, I was in the company of a Syrian First Lieutenant, Talal, whom I know quite well. He was actually watching to see if there was any thin wires connected to mines. We didn't find any. But I did take up from the floor one of the slashed pieces of painting. And here it is. You can actually see what happened. There's the saint's head. That's exactly what I found on the floor of the church. This is what it's like to be a Christian in the Middle East at the moment. It's a highly symbolic strip of material. So, it's part of the great Christian exodus, part of the great tragedy of the Middle East at the moment. I went to see Bishop Hojhannes Eskijian, of course you know very well, on Tuesday at his office. An office, of course, which those of you who know him in Damascus, his back wall is actually part of the wall of Damascus city, the ancient wall. His estimate, which he may have given to you, but his estimate now is that 25,000 to 30,000 Armenians have left Syria, 12,000 to America, 10,000 to 12,000 in Lebanon, and then several thousand in Europe. Out of 110,000, the biggest community to have left, of course, is that of Aleppo. Out of 110,000 then, we have perhaps up to 30,000 Armenians who've left. That is the diminution. Everybody, as the bishop said to me, everybody says, we're coming back, we're only going temporarily away. Palestinians said that once, didn't they? And of course, many of those Armenian families will never go back. Because when you leave and you stay away for a time, you have to start building up a new home, your children have to go to school, perhaps your daughters and sons get married. So that community is going. Your community is going from Syria. And much of it will not return. I've many times gone through the details of the Armenian suffering in Syria. Very tiny, of course, in comparison to that of most Syrians. I mean, perhaps we're talking of 80 Armenian dead now. We don't know in some areas what the situation is, and we, of course, rely on the usual rumours which we can't confirm. In Aleppo, you probably know that an Armenian church was vandalised by the Free Syrian Army, the famous Arab rebels, the good guys, you see, who are fighting, or were fighting then, Bashar al-Assad's regime, funded and armed by the Americans and the Gulf Arabs. In Raqqa, the only Syrian city to be totally captured by the opposition in Syria, Salafist fighters did trash the Armenian Catholic Church of the Martyrs and set fire to its furnishings. And many hundreds of Turkish fighters, descendants of the same Turks who tried to destroy the Armenians in 1915, in fact, not so many hundreds, perhaps 200 or 300 have joined Al-Qaeda. So the same people who attacked the Armenian church. There's a kind of awful historical circle going on now inside Syria. Indeed, in many of the areas of northern Syria where those Syrians are dying, they're dying in places where you can still find the bones and skulls of the Armenians of 1915. This is the killing field country. On 11th of November, when the world honoured the dead of the Great War, which of course did not give the Armenians the state they deserved, a mortar shell, as you know, fell outside the bishop's church, killing 2 children and a bus driver. A day later, a busload of Armenians travelling from Beirut to Aleppo were robbed at gunpoint. 2 days later, Kevork Boghasian was killed by a mortar shell in Aleppo, and so on and so forth. It's a story of constant departure, of exodus, if you like. In the Armenian church at Deir ez-Zor, there's been considerable damage, deliberate, not by shellfire. And indeed, the glass covering of the bones in the crypt of the church, which some of you, I'm sure, have seen, has been broken. I was particularly struck by this because way back in 1991, I went up to central Syria to try and find the bones of the Armenians. And in fact, I found a lady in her, more than 100, she's about 103, who, of course, we're talking about 1991, she had a very clear memory of the Holocaust of the Armenians. My newspaper calls it a Holocaust, by the way, with a capital H, as it does the Jewish Holocaust. And she told me how she remembered going back to try and find the bones of her father and her 2 sisters who were taken away by the Turks. And she remembered finding a hill called Hurghada, where all the bones were piled up, just smashed around, with dogs eating what was left. And she couldn't find, of course, her father or her sister's bones. I found the hill of Hurghada, which was next to the Habel River. But I couldn't identify it as the hill of Hurghada because there was no Habel River there. It was only when my French photographer, it had been raining very heavily, got to the top of the hill and started shouting, "Robert, Robert, come here and look." And we got to the top of the hill, and the rain had washed away a huge section of the incline, and embedded in it were bones and skulls and skeletons. This was the killing fields. The river, you could see the track of a river of maybe 50, 80, 100 years ago, had moved a mile, probably because there were so many bodies inside it. It had moved its course. We dug some with my car keys, we dug some of these skulls and bones out of the ground. I had an Armenian family with me. And in fact, eventually, after we'd spent some time there, we took the bones to Deir ez-Zor and put them in the crypt of the church where the glass is now broken. I'm giving you this as a report from Syria. Now, this week, indeed, as I say, I left Syria on Thursday. I met, a couple of weeks ago, Katya Patekian, who many of you will know has been compiling at enormous expense and time the records of the newspapers, some of which you saw from Hank just now, of the genocide. Her latest 2-volume book of newspaper clippings are from the British press, the Manchester Guardian and the Times. Alas, the Independent, my paper wasn't around in those days. Last 2 volumes are totaling 974 pages. What struck me very much, and what struck me as very interesting, is that, you know, the details going into the world's press, Halifax newspapers, the Washington Post, New York Times rather, were very, very accurate, and they were accurate within 2 weeks of the genocidal events taking place each day inside Anatolia and around Western Armenia. In other words, if you lived in New York or London, you read the names of leading Armenian figures within 2 weeks of their murder in the genocide. So we knew very quickly what was happening. Strangely enough, in the Second World War, where the communications photographs were much better, the real revelations of the Nazi wickedness towards the Jews of Europe in the Holocaust really only began to get traction in newspapers in 1943, 2 years after Hitler invaded, June of 1941, the Soviet Union, and the Einsatzgruppen moved into the Ukraine and Belarus and occupied the Soviet Union and started mass killing with weapons and later with gas in occupied Russia. This is before, of course, the extermination camps in Poland. And yet there was very little response shown towards the Jews of Europe in Britain, for example, which was unoccupied by the Germans, and even in America. So you have a strange and odd parallel where in the First World War, within days of massacres of Armenians, questions were being asked in the House of Parliament. But in the Second World War, the British press and the American press showed a shameful lack of interest in the tens of thousands of Jews who were being exterminated by the Nazis. Churchill, as you probably know, was asked by prominent British Jews to intervene with the Royal Air Force and bomb the rail yards of Auschwitz to stop the trains reaching the gas chambers. He sent a memo saying, yes, this seems a good idea. The Royal Air Force were more interested in finishing the war. Their excuse was, oh well, when we finish the war, the Holocaust will end. They didn't call it the Holocaust then, of course, the killing of Jews would end. But of course, by the time we did win the war, there were pitifully few Jews left after Hitler had murdered most of them. In the end, of course, we also, after the First World War, we betrayed you. There was supposed to be an American mandate, wasn't there, for Armenia, which was never taken up. And the British, at the end of the day, we decided, we put a few people on trial, as you know, but at the end of the day we lost interest. A new chap in Turkey was a Marxist modernist, Kemal Mustafa, who actually changed Arabic script into Latin script and so on. Oddly enough, Stalin did the same in Tajikistan. He banned Arabic and switched it over to Cyrillics, but we thought that was a great act against civilization. Already the hypocrisy had begun. But we betrayed you. The West betrayed you. In many ways, we still do betray you. The press coverage, the coverage of my colleagues of the Armenian genocide today is still not adequate. It is, in some cases, quite cowardly. I think you're winning your war to prove to the world, your struggle, shall we say, that the genocide is a reality. Of course it was, we know that. But you still find, for example, cowardly reports on Reuters about the alleged genocide, or massacres which Armenians regard as genocide, but which is hotly disputed. Hotly disputed is the phrase they love, in Turkey. So, and of course, Reuters has a bureau in Ankara, so we don't want too many problems with the Turks. But this kind of thing is actually quite suffocating and quite contagious, because once news editors see there's a problem about the genocide, they'd rather stay away from it. No problem, or should there be, in discussing the Jewish Holocaust. The Germans, the new German government is fully acknowledging it. So there's no diversion there, there's no balance meant. There shouldn't be a balance. The Nazi Holocaust was one of the greatest crimes in the history of the world, if not the greatest crime. But so was the Armenian genocide, and yet still newspapers try to escape round the corner. I agree with Hake that records and files are one of the ways which you have to keep bashing on to get out the truth of the Armenian genocide. Think, as I wrote once, Captain Tarosian. You realise, of course, next year that the Turks are going to attempt to smother the anniversary of the Armenian genocide with tales of Allied heroism at Gallipoli, a battle which, of course, the Turks rightly won. It was an invasion of their territory. But already, loyalist academics have done their best to ignore the presence of thousands of Arab troops who fought in 1915 on the Turkish Ottoman side against the Allies. One of them, well, he wasn't an Arab, because he was an Armenian, was Captain Sarkis Tarosian, who personally was awarded medals for his courage by the Ottoman Turks. And yet, once his story began to be told, he wrote a whole book about it, published here in the United States. Turks began to suggest that he was a fiction, that he lied, that his story was made up. In fact, he changed sides only after he found his own sister dying in the refugee death marches. But he was a senior officer in the Ottoman army. He also didn't like Lawrence of Arabia very much. I'd rather share that feeling with him. But here's Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu speaking in Gallipoli in 2011. He gave a perfectly frank account of how Turkey planned to define the Armenian genocide on its 100th anniversary. We are going to make the year of 1915 known the whole world over, he said, not as an anniversary of a genocide, as some people claimed and slandered, lied, but we shall make it known as a glorious resistance of a nation. In other words, a commemoration of our defence of Gallipoli. So, stand by for next year, not just for you, but for the Turks. I plan to go to the Gallipoli commemorations. I can't wait. So, Turkish nationalism is supposed to win over, and it's supposed to win over the history next year. Descendants of those who died in the Anzac troops at Gallipoli might, I hope, ask their Turkish hosts why they do not honour those brave Arabs and Armenians and Turks, including Captain Tarosian, who actually were on the side of the Armenians. I'm talking of the many detailed accounts of Turkish officers and sometimes gendarme policemen who protected Armenian women from rape, either at the hands of their fellow Turks or of the Kurds, who of course were also Ottomans. I've often campaigned, totally without success, with your people that you should open a book of honour to the brave Turks who we know tried to save the Armenians, and then invite the Turks to admire that book, because these are the brave Turks, are they not? If they admire them, then you'll put another step on the way to their acknowledgement of the genocide. If they refuse, why do they refuse? If I'm wrong in saying this, please forgive me, but it's my understanding that the Turkish consul in Los Angeles was not invited to your conference. That was a big mistake. I think that's a matter of shame. You should have invited him. He probably wouldn't have come. But bring him in. Invite him. This conference should be open. You know, as an impartial journalist, quote unquote, I would like to feel that this meeting was open to everyone, including the Turkish Consul General. You should have invited him. Big mistake. But let me go back to details. Again, I'm going back to Haig's point. How to get more and more details, new details of what actually happened in the genocide and afterwards. There are many archives which have so far not been sought out and gone through. Many private papers in Britain are only now being published. Private papers originally set up as a sort of manuscript that was never published by British officers. Of course, the Australian and British Army saw the remnants of the Armenian community coming down through Deir ez-Zor and other Syrian cities in 1918. For example, there's a new book just come out in Britain by, I'll give you the name of it actually, it's In the Front Line, A Doctor in War and Peace by Alec Glenn. Now, Alec Glenn was a Glasgow doctor who was in the British Army. His son discovered the manuscript 2 years ago and published it. It's his story of what it's like to be fighting in Mesopotamia and in Syria. I just want to read you a short bit because he's marching now through northwestern Iran towards Baku. This is 1918, the Turkestan movement was moving eastwards. And Glenn writes, and this is his words, and you probably have never read this, and no Armenian has actually picked up on this, I picked it up. He writes, "It was an amazing and tragic sight." This is a British Indian force he was leading. "It was an amazing and tragic sight. Now and then we passed at a roadside a dying person, or one already dead and half eaten by dogs and jackals. We lifted some of the younger Armenians who might recover onto the mules and carried them forward to the next village. Salisbury Craig," he was a fellow British doctor with Glenn, "told me later that he attended an old refugee in the road who, before he died, gave him a leather belt full of sovereigns, which he asked him to spend to help living refugees. Greater love hath no man." I got a letter not long ago from the granddaughter of an Armenian woman. She's married to a non-Armenian Brit. And I had written about, of course, the Armenians, as I constantly do in the paper. Here is her actual handwritten letter. She's a bit elderly, so I'm going to have to take my glasses off to read it. She's talking about the same period of 1915 and 16. "Reading further proof of Turkey's genocide," she means the Armenian genocide, "rang bells with me. My grandparents left Czechoslovakia and went east to Baghdad, Aleppo, Beirut, Alexandria, Cairo. They were musicians. In 1915, well, we're in the right mood for musicians today. In 1915-16, Papa, my grandfather, was called up to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army, because, of course, he came from Czechoslovakia, or what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And while he was away, my grandmother lived in either Aleppo or Beirut, it's not clear. It was learned that the Turks were coming, massacring Christians. And my grandmother's neighbour, a Jewish lady, rushed round to her and gave her a Star of David to wear. When the knock on the door came, my grandmother opened it and brandished the Star of David round her neck, and she was not touched." Now this is original material, and it came through the mail to me. There is a much more original material to be had. I keep a diary from time to time, and I have a diary here of an episode in 26th of April 2010. I was in Canada talking to Armenians, of course, Armenian Genocide Day. And this is what I wrote in my diary at the time. You can't express things better than you do in the original diary because you can't remember them as well. "Last night I was interviewed about the genocide on CTV, Canadian television. But I was stunned to hear the genocide described on CTV as deadly massacres. This preposterous phrase was actually very revealing. The masters of Canadian television clearly know that the Armenian genocide, a word they would not use, of course, was on a massive scale. 1.5 million dead is a bit big for just a massacre, so they went for a ridiculous tautology. It was not just a massacre, it was a deadly massacre. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. When is a massacre not deadly? Have you ever heard of an undeadly massacre? A massacre in which everyone lives? It's like talking about a lethal murder or a death-inducing homicide. But this also produces a kind of slidey journalism, which often accompanies this form of genocide denial. This is still from my diary. In yesterday's Toronto Globe and Mail, for example, Geoffrey Simpson advanced I've never met this guy, I have no intention of doing so, advanced an argument about the Armenian genocide, which, if used about Jewish victims of the Nazis, would have pleased Adolf Hitler. Firstly, he put the word genocide in quotation marks, which is about as insulting as you can get. But then he advanced the following thesis, which Haig will spot immediately because he's been talking about it in the context of dozens of years ago. Multiculturalism, Geoffrey Simpson wrote, can be dangerous if diaspora politics twist Canada's foreign policy to suit ethnic demands. That is exactly what was happening 80 years ago. Exactly the same argument. And I go on here. Incredibly, Simpson went on to say that the Armenian diaspora is particularly mobilized to press governments to denounce the events during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and World War I. Note the word events, ladies and gentlemen. Even though what happened did not involve Canada and does not involve Canada today. Canada lost tens of thousands of men in the First World War. Canada raised relief for the victims of the Armenian genocide. And it does not involve Canada. He has totally deleted Canadian history. It's a lie. I was under the impression that 500,000 Canadians fought in the First World War. Let's imagine now what would happen if the Globe and Mail decided to distance itself from the Jewish Holocaust, perhaps by putting Holocaust in inverted commas, or if faced by German denial, washed its hands of the 6 million Jewish dead on the grounds that Canada was not involved in the Second World War, which of course it was. I wrote again in my diary, can you see what is happening? We are not only denying the Armenian genocide. To do so, we're also rewriting history. I was wrong. We are negating history. Why do we journalists write like this? Is it because we are frightened of the Turkish lobby, for example? We certainly aren't frightened of other genocides we're writing about. Then I found some British civil servants' advice to government ministers in the United Kingdom. This is 2007. This is civil servants writing to their ministers of how to deal with questions about that wretched genocide of the Armenians. It has proved extremely difficult to... I'm going to put my civil service voice on. It has proved extremely difficult to disentangle the truth. And the issues remain a subject of considerable controversy. There you are, highly disputed again. Observers are far from unanimous as to whether the massacres and deaths that occurred during the deportations constitute an official campaign of genocide. This is, of course, our friend, my lovely friend, Mr. Blair, we're talking about, isn't it? Officially, the British government, acknowledges the strength of feeling about what it describes as a terrible episode of history. But it calls it a tragedy. However, neither the current government nor previous British governments have judged that the evidence is sufficiently unequivocal to persuade it that these events should be categorised as genocide. That's a lie. The Bryce report, published during the First World War, was published by the British Foreign Office. So you see, the genocide denial, a form of Holocaust denial, exists within governments, within journalists. Again, I think that you're winning the battle in the press now. The New York Times, which was one of the first to reveal the genocide, up to 20 years ago was referring to the alleged genocide, hotly disputed, etc. Now it calls it the Armenian genocide without equivocation. You made it. An Armenian delegation went to the New York Times and kicked that lazy newspaper into acknowledging the truth which it itself exposed years before in its own exclusives. I think another thing about the Turks, there are many, many Turks who fully acknowledge, when we chat to them privately, when I'm in Turkey, that the Armenian genocide is a fact of history. During the earthquake in 1999, I went to Istanbul to report it. And the first area I could get to, and I was looking for a deadline, trying to report on what was happening, I found Turkey's top geologist, an earthquake expert, wandering with his daughter through the ruins. Fluent English, I can't speak Turkish. And he said, can you imagine, he said, my government won't even pay my taxi fares to come and look at this. So I said, but the Independent will, come with me. He worked with me for 2 weeks. Brilliant guy. At the end, we all had a big lunch by the Bosphorus in lots of buzz-bag red wine, of course. And, all the families of his fellow geologists came along, all Turkish, civil servants, government workers. And we sat around the table and ate and drank, and then I said, look, I've got a question for you all. What about the Armenian genocide? And there wasn't a ripple of embarrassment. And my friend said, Robert, we all know it's a fact of history. The genocide took place. In 2009, when the Turkish edition of my book, The Great War for Civilization, came out, a book which has a pretty ferocious chapter on the Armenian genocide, I toured all over Turkey giving talks on television, interviews. I talked about the genocide. Only once, just once on television, did I have a confrontation. The argument was, well, the Armenians must have done something wrong if that happened, which is it's the same argument that anti-Semites use about the Jews of Europe. But it was the only time. And what was particularly moving was on my last day, actually, back in Istanbul, it was the Istanbul Book Fair. A long queue of people, says Mr. Bob, looking forward to good royalties on his Turkish edition. A long queue of Turks formed to have me sign the book. And one young man, very educated, perfect English, said to me, my father saw you talking about the Armenian genocide on Turkish state television last night, and he asked me to come here and ask you to dedicate your book to him. So, of course, I didn't write it away. What does your father do? And the young man said, he's the chief of the Istanbul police. It's not laughing, man. Quite serious. You know, one of the things which you discover in Turkey now is that many, many Turks are discovering that their Turkish grandmothers were not Muslims. There is a tiny book, only 116 pages long, containing a monumental truth. It's called My Grandmother, a Memoir, and it's written by Fatiha Çetin, and it opens up graves. When she was growing up in the Turkish town of Mardin, Fatiha's grandmother, Seher, was known as a respected Muslim housewife. She was a respected housewife, but she wasn't Muslim. She was a Christian Armenian, and her real name was Haranos. We all know, of course, that the modern Turkish state will not acknowledge the 1915 Armenian Holocaust, but this humble book, which you should read, may help to change that. As children, of course, everyone was put to death on death marches, babies too. But in this case, Haranos, whose face stares out at the reader from beneath her Muslim headscarf on the cover, was seized by a Turkish gendarme who sped off on horseback after lashing her mother with a whip. Even when she died of old age, Fatiha tried to record the names of Haranos' Armenian parents, Eskijian and Hojhannes, but was ignored by the mosque authorities. It was Haranos, with her razor memory, who taught Fatiha of her family's fate. And this book does record in terrible detail the now familiar saga of mass cruelty, rape and butchery. In one town, the Turkish police separated husbands, sons and old men. And Haranos looked over the wall. She climbed up with another child and saw the men being executed outside the wall. Fatiha says she wrote her grandmother's story. Fatiha is, of course, a Turkish woman. Now, she wrote her grandmother's story to reconcile us with our history, but also to reconcile us with ourselves. Of course, Ataturk's decision to move from Arabic to Latin script also means that vital Ottoman documents recording the genocide cannot be consulted by most modern-day Turks. They can by some, as we know. And about the same time, it's interesting to note, by the way, that Stalin was converting, as I say, the Arabic script into Cyrillics. And there, of course, it was called the murder of civilization. And so, history faded away. I'm indebted, however, to bringing this to my attention, to Cosetta Vakian, who sent me Fatiha's book, and who is herself the granddaughter of Armenian survivors, and who brought me news of another memorial of Armenians, this time in Wales. Wales, you may ask? And when I had this particular memorial, a handsome Armenian cross embedded in stone that was vandalized on Holocaust Memorial Day in 2008, you may also know and imagine the truth. Not a single British national newspaper reported it. Had it been a Jewish Holocaust memorial stone that was desecrated, it would rightly have been recorded, no doubt, in some cases on our front pages. But Armenians didn't count. As Welsh Armenians said on the day, this is our holiest shrine. Our grandparents who perished in the genocide do not have marked graves. This is where we remember them. No one knows who destroyed the stone. A request for condemnation by the Turkish embassy in London went, of course, unheeded. While in Liverpool on Holocaust Day, the Armenians were not even mentioned in the service. Well, I asked myself, I suppose, who will be the identity of the next man to wield a hammer against that Armenian genocide memorial in Wales? I don't know if there's much to do other than say, you're winning the battle for recognition. You're getting there. I find fewer and fewer people I meet at lectures, not addressing Armenians, but others, who actually have any doubts about the genocide. I think you're winning that battle, but you've got to keep going. What I think you're not actually doing perhaps quite enough on is not the research, which Haig spoke so eloquently about, into getting every possible document that ever exists in the world now on the genocide, or from all over. Australian records, for example, British military records. I think it's that you're not yet working out how you're going to memorialise the Armenian Holocaust, or genocide if you like, in 100 or 200 years' time. I've had discussions with Jewish friends in Jerusalem of what's going to happen when the last Jewish survivor of the Nazi Holocaust dies, and their children die, and their grandchildren die. And I don't know how you do this, but you should think about it, because I don't think just having an Armenian Genocide Museum in Washington is going to keep this piece of history alive in the minds of the world. I suggested to my Jewish friends in Jerusalem that one of the things they need to emphasize is that the Jews of the Holocaust represent us. Of course they were Jewish, and the Jewish identity of these people must remain forever. They were killed because they were Jews by Hitler. If they'd been Aryans, they would not have been murdered, and they weren't. The Aryans of Germany were not murdered. Well, they were killed in large numbers, but they weren't murdered by Hitler. And the Armenians were murdered because they were Armenians. If they were other Muslim citizens of the Ottoman Empire, they would not have been, unless they were converted, they would not have been massacred in 1.5 million in 1915. And my argument has always been that while maintaining strictly and totally the identity of those who suffered the genocide, the two great genocides of the last century, it is more and more important to identify them with people who are non-Armenian and non-Jewish. When the first book my mum let me read as a child was The Diary of Anne Frank. Of course, because it's a beautiful book, it's genuine, and there were some extracts left out in the first editions, but the real full edition is stunning. And I remember I must have been at 10 or 11. I learned to read pretty well. My parents taught me to read before I went to school. And I remember thinking that Anne Frank was just like my cousin. I'm not Jewish as far as I know, but my family originally came from the Baltic area. But it didn't strike me. What struck me was that this little girl was like my cousin, or like the sisters of lots of my school friends. There was another book I read not long ago, which had an incredibly moving moment when it was a British survivor of the Holocaust who had, of course, remarried, but his wife and child were killed at Auschwitz. And he saw them taken away. They went to the selection ramps at Auschwitz. And he was separated from his young wife and their baby. And he was sent off down a track towards the labour barracks. He was going to be used for hard labour by the Nazis. His young wife and baby, of course, were being put on a truck to be sent straight to the gas chambers. It was at night, of course, as most of the transports arrived in Auschwitz at night. It was a huge searchlight from the Nazis. And as he walked up the track, a truck passed him, a German army truck, and sitting right at the back under the floodlights was his young wife, who held out his baby for the last time he could see him. My reaction was, God, that could be me. And that is the only way, I think, that you can keep the memory of your genocide and the Jewish Holocaust alive, to constantly remind people that you're just like us, and that we are just like you. And that, I think, is the only way in which in hundreds of years' time, or 1,000 years' time, people will identify directly with your suffering and with Jewish suffering. On that note, thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm going to start with give Robert a chance to collect his breath. Hi, Des Moines, can you comment on why Hollywood would have been in cooperation with the Nazis when many of the studio heads were Jewish another explanation be Hiller's line that, quote, no one remembers the Armenians, why would they remember the Jews? Hence suppression of the film.
Well, it's true. While reading that book I showed you, I found a lot of evidence that many Hollywood studios tried to shoot films on Jewish persecution in Nazi Germany. They were always under pressure, but nothing is 100%. Of course, there were economics, there were collaboration because of the German market. This lasted until late 1930s, and great dictator finally appeared in 1940. This was the end of collaboration some way. But yes, many studios were headed by Jews, but this doesn't matter nothing. It continued several years, starting from 1932 until 1938, when almighty German chancellor of Nazi Germany played a leading role in dealing with the Hollywood studios, censoring and restricting movies. And one addition I forgot to say, if you remember, 1935 is also important for MGM, for another movie that was scheduled and called 40 Days of Musada. Till now we were thinking that Turkish government pressed Americans to cancel this, but we have to track also traces of these activities of Nazi Germany's counselor in LA, who supposedly pressed MGM to cancel this movie because 40 Days of Musada is another First World War history, and Germany actively lobbied again to return back his First World War era ally, Turkey. There was a heavy negotiations to join Turkey to Italy and Germany at that time. That's why we have to track also the possible activities on aborting these possibilities of shooting 40 Days of Musada. Thank you.
Okay, we have so many good questions here, so I'm going to really try to get through as many as I can in the short time we have. Dr. Fisk, from your experiences from a remarkable career witnessing and reporting constant turmoil in the Middle East, what hope do you have for peace between Muslims and Christians, Muslims and Jews, and more globally, the end of genocide? Now, there's a very idealistic but a good question to ask after the day that we've had today.
I think it's the wrong question. I don't think it's a question of Sunnis versus Shiites and Muslims versus Jews or Muslims versus Christians. The divide in the Middle East, as one of my colleagues in Lebanon says, is between sectarians and non-sectarians. It's between whether you belong to an educated society that believes in a nation or whether you believe in a tribe and a religion more than you believe in citizenship, human rights, and equal rights. And I think that, we Westerners, we love chopping up you people into religions. All the maps we carry of Iraq, where we show the Shiites at the bottom, the Sunnis in the middle, in the so-called triangle, actually looks more like a pentagon, but anyway, you get to Kurdistan, there are Sunnis up there. In Lebanon, we have the Shiites at the bottom, we have the Sunnis inside, and then we have different colours for the Christians in East Beirut and so on. We did the same in Belfast, the British Army, by the way. But oddly enough, when we're dealing with our societies in the West, we do not show these maps. I can take you to Montreal and show you the front line between French speakers and English speakers. It runs down the metro track, by the way. I can draw you a map of black and white Washington, but that map will never appear in the Washington Post. You will never see a map of Muslim and non-Muslim citizens of the United Kingdom in the city of Birmingham. Because our society, we are not split up, we're all unified. But we're constantly emphasizing, for what reason, well, we could discuss that another time. I won't say, but we want a divided Middle East. We want to emphasize it, and we want to see it in terms of religion. And this is a major problem, because I now get American TV and radio stations calling me up in Beirut, and it is incomprehensible. The question has to be turned around, and then I can answer a question which I phrase, because they want me to join in this. Not long ago, 3 years ago, 4, I was walking through New York City and I saw a copy of Time magazine, an execrable edition which I loan. I don't like Time magazine. Anyway, I bought it because the cover was so outrageously funny. It was How to Tell a Sunni from a Shiite. And I thought, well, why don't you just drop this magazine by parachute over Baghdad? It might help to keep the civil war going. So my answer to you is, what hope of peace? Stop talking about war between Muslims and Christians and Muslims and Jews. Talk about sectarians and non-sectarians, which is about racists and non-racists.
To Dr. De Moyen, if Ravished Armenia was screened in France, then isn't that the most promising place to seek out the rest of the film? Because the French have done more for film preservation than any other nation.
Well, it's a good question. I said about this survival part, which was found out my friend of Yervan Setian back in 1938. It was once screened in 1926 in Marseille. But another place we have to look, it's archives of the United Nations, now or formerly League of Nations. But while doing some archive research, my friend Robert maybe knows or not, there are some difficulties. For example, to get Armenian files in League of Nations archives with a tattooed woman, currently saved, many of them. My colleague from the US was restricted to get only 5 of photos with tattooed Armenian women. The question was why? Because much more materials could offend member countries. And why I brought this example, but maybe, I hope, that somewhere on one of the shelves in the movie archives, probably in Australia or in Holland or in France, maybe a different name as it happened with the extra copy identified in Armenian archives, we can identify and find preserved full version of Ravished Armenian, but we hope so. Because there are also technological problems, because these reels survive only for 70, 80 years. After that they just perish, and you cannot find if it's not copied. The guy found the copied version, and we are very thankful for him because he made double copies of the survived 18-minute footage. So we will keep to find and track the possibilities of finding a full version of Ravished Armenian. Our hope is that geography was very large geography from Australia to Canada, American states, and was probably also private archives, still untouched.
Can I just add one thing to this? I've been hunting for movie film of the genocide for years and years and years. A little bit of success in the United States on the East Coast, in government archives. There is one piece of film I've been desperately trying to find. As you probably know, there was an Armenian legion serving with the French army trained in Alexandria, after they fled Armenia. And they marched into Cilicia with the French army in 1918. And in Anjar, in of course eastern Lebanon, in the chapel there, where the martyrs of Musadag have now been reburied after the French betrayed Iskandariya in 1939, there is a photograph of French troops and French officers marching in to Cilicia. And behind the French soldiers, you can see a young soldier, probably an Armenian, in French uniform, with a movie camera. And I think I found the film, but it's filed wrongly, and I haven't been able to see it yet. It's in Paris. I'm not going to tell you any more because I want to get at that film before you do. But it's immensely difficult. You've really got to hunt down where film was taken. But the one thing that is certain, and which is the great hope, and I think Heike will agree with me, is that in the First World War, even inside Turkey, the movie camera was the state-of-the-art technology of the time. It was their internet, website, etc. And so lots and lots of people wanted cameras. My own father, against all the rules of the British Army, took a box camera to the trenches of the Third Battle of the Somme. I have him in a steel helmet on a picture, because British troops were smuggling cameras in. So were Germans into Turkey serving under the Ottoman Empire.
So So we have a series of questions which are somewhat related, and I'm going to give you a choice here. With regard to Syria, to Robert Fisk, who do you think is responsible for the Syrian conflict? That's an easy one to answer.
I think I'm going to bed. Oh, no, hold on, I'll try and do it. Who was responsible for the Syrian conflict? Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot, Lord Balfour, General Omi Gouraud, who divided Syria off and created the new state of Lebanon, McMahon, the British officer and Governor General in Cairo, who lied to the Arabs and promised them Arab independence when in fact he knew very well that they weren't going to get it. Hence we know that poor old King Faisal got chucked out of Damascus and Winston Churchill gave him Jordan as a consolation prize. Those are the people who are responsible for the collapse of Syria.
We have a comment from a member of our audience. I'd like to thank the Consulate of Greece for the Greek help in relocating the Armenian refugees from the Ottoman Empire. That's a comment. Here's a question about Jerusalem. Robert Fisk, may I pose an absurd, mindless question? When
They're the ones I like.
When Israel emerged as a state in 1948, how could the history of the Near East have unfolded differently if Jerusalem had been established as an international city belonging to the three monotheistic faiths instead of the Israelis or the Palestinians controlled by the UN?
Well, I have to say personally, I wish it had been an international city, but it wasn't. And it was never the intention, I think, of the new state of Israel that it should have that state. And I don't think at the time, I'm speaking frankly, I don't think the Arabs wanted it to be an international city. We did, because of course after the Second World War we had lots of humanitarian instincts. We didn't want a repeat version of World War II. International cities don't usually work very well, by the way. Danzig is a good example. But I wish it had been an international city, and I wish that a state like Israel, which is immensely gifted and has so many good people in it, would stop taking Arab land and destroying any hope of a joint capital in Jerusalem.
Two questions about Turkey, again related, and I'll read both of them to you. First question, can we think that Turkey, by helping the Islamists in the Middle East, is planning to continue the genocide of Armenians?
No.
And here's the second question. What are the odds the Armenian genocide awareness and knowledge by the Turkish grassroots base reaching critical mass? What are the odds of it reaching critical mass? Is it enough for the Turkish state government to venture official recognition without the fear of political suicide at home? Will this happen anytime soon, ever? After all, Armenia needs living next to Turkey regardless of recognition by other states. A couple of thoughts there.
It's not going to happen like that. The idea that you're suddenly going to say, you're not going to put recognition of the Armenian genocide in your political platform for election in Turkey, and that's not going to be like that. The fact that academics are talking quite openly in Turkey about the genocide, they still won't use the word, but it's coming. The fact that many Turks will frankly talk to educated Turks, many cities in Turkey, about the genocide. Their concern, of course, I think the real Turkish concern about the genocide is not that it damages the prestige of the Turkish state. We all know that these terrible events occurred under the Ottoman Empire. And we all know that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was not involved in the genocide. But we do know that those who helped to found the Turkish state with Atatürk, and who thus contaminate him by their presence in power, were involved in the genocide. And that, I think, lies at the political ideological end of refusal to acknowledge. The real background to it is, I think the Turkish state fears that Armenians, quite rightly, will demand massive compensation from Turkey. Don't worry, the Americans will pay, but will demand massive compensation from Turkey for the mass theft of Armenian land, as well as the 1.5 million dead.
I just want to add, as a former Soviet citizen, I always identify myself while communicating with Turks. And I always bring the example of last years of the Soviet Union and the process of collapse of the Soviet Union. It was psychological collapse, first of all. It was collapsed because of rewriting history. It was collapsed because heroes were dethroned. Believe me, the most dangerous thing, or one of the most dangerous things in the history, it's a rewriting of this history. Turks, I agree with Robert, mostly they are afraid of this revising of state-building myth, nation-building myth. And the topic of Armenian genocide plays as a catalyst. This is the main fear, the main fear of Turks lay here. And I believe also that they keep close the border with Armenia because they are afraid of revival of Armenian presence. It depends on any status or any folding of Armenians in the territories, any interaction of Armenians with the remains of the Armenians there. This is really sounds like anathema for Turks. And the second part of my answer will be how we have to deal with Turkish society, civil society, young generation. Yes, we have to confess that we missed some opportunities within last decades. Although we have some interesting results, it is Turkish society, they discuss this openly. There is an academic approach, non-denialist approach in Turkey, which was impossible to imagine, let's say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But now it's heavily discussed. A fresh example related to the topic of my presentation I did. A new version, Turkish translation of Revished Armenia was printed in Turkey, in Turkish. How it happened? Last November, Turkish journalist interviewed me in the museum. And I said, by the way, do you know this story? I strongly recommend to read this book. It is in English, and I gave a copy of English book. Then I found out that after 4 months, they translated it. So there are a lot of opportunities to go in deep of the society and explain them, educate them. And the modern technologies allow us to do this through websites, through social networking. But we have to do this very carefully, taking into account all possibilities and the peculiarities of working with that society. Society which is under heavy control of the state tradition. And if we lift this control, we'll have a possible partner to whom we can talk with about the past. Because Armenian genocide is not only history and memory of Armenian people, it's also history and memory of Turkish people. That's why I agree with Robert that Turkish consular must be here to learn their own history.
I did not mention earlier, and I apologize, we had a participant, Aisha Gunasu, who was supposed to come from Turkey, and she could not be here because her mother's in the hospital, so I'm sorry about that. And also to add that Fethi Çetin, who Robert Fisk mentioned, as many of you would know, her story, my grandmother's story, my grandmother, Fethi Çetin is her Aunt Dink's lawyer. And actually she learned about her Armenian roots because she knew her Aunt Dink, and her Aunt Dink encouraged her to look into her own past. And like so many Turkish citizens, she discovered that her past was partly Armenian. And so a very interesting story there. A question to Haig. How did Aurora die? Where and where is she buried?
Well, I said in my presentation that the last weeks she spent in the Ararat home right here, and even I was in a room a couple of days ago where she spent a couple of weeks, and in early February she was transferred to Providence Hospital, which is not far from here, and she died on the next day. As far as I know, from the research done with enthusiasts and the researchers, for example, our men also did, her body was not claimed really for years. And then it was burned with other nearly 3,000 bodies non-claimed, and the remains are buried in one of the parks here in Hollywood area.
Because time is short, I'm going to read the last 4 questions that I have, and you gentlemen, you can choose how you choose to respond. That's up to you. To Robert Fisk, Question number 1, do you think there is an advantage to unite the Armenian genocide with that of the Assyrians and Greek Pontis, which would total 3.5 million? Then the Turks could not keep denying. That's question number 1. Question number 2, who slipped 400 tons of Armenian and Greek corpses to France during the First World War? I think that's following on the bones discussion. To Dr. Fisk, and I think you answered this, but I'm going to still read the question. The major media in the US and England present a distorted view of events in Syria and elsewhere. They treat us like mushrooms. They keep us in the dark and feed us BS. The major media is supposed to be fair and balanced, They are anything but that. Where is the US heading with these lies? And finally, how do you explain the dismantling of Armenian factories in Aleppo and relocation into Turkey? It's quite an assortment there.
You start. I don't believe that you can go around playing games with the numbers of genocide victims. You know, I mean, it's like saying, well, are the victims of the Holodomor, the great Stalinist hungers in Ukraine, which were deliberate and which go into the millions? Are you going to mix them up with the Armenians or with the victims of the Jewish Holocaust? I think each people's suffering is unique, and you shouldn't try to push the figures together to make the Turks more guilty. That's not. Once you start playing games with millions of dead bodies, you've gone off the railroad track. There's no point doing that. As far as the media in America is concerned, I despair of it, of course. Tom Friedman is apparently charging $100,000 an hour for lectures now. I would pay $100,000 if I had it not to listen to Tom Friedman for an hour. Look, the problem is that in this country, the press has become osmotic as well as parasitic. It feeds and becomes the echo chamber of power. You know, I've got examples here, I won't go through them now, of the way in which, for example, so many great scoops in the American press. Actually, I will. Here's the Boston Globe. This is a Middle East story. Here are the sources. I'll just run through it. High speed. US intelligence officials said, US officials said, senior US intelligence officials said, US officials said, US officials intelligence assisted, a senior... This is the Boston Globe of 2nd of November 2012, if you want to check it. When you have this kind of journalism, I'm out of a job. And I think one of the problems is that this thing about neutrality and objectivity has gone mad. Yes, our job as journalists should be to be neutral and objective on the side of those who suffer. If we were reporting the slave trade in the 18th century, are we supposed to have official say and give equal time to the slave ship captain as the slaves? If we were present at the liberation of a Nazi extermination camp, do we give equal time to the SS as well as the victims? When I was in the Sabra Shatila camp in 82, when the massacre was still going on, was I supposed to give equal time to the Israeli army spokesman because the Israelis watched it as I did to the victims? No. And the problem is that in American journalism, you have what's called 50-50 journalism. It means one side gets half your story, the other side gets half your story. That's okay if you're reporting a baseball match or a new motorway, and those people who object to it. But the Middle East is not a baseball match, it is a bloody tragedy. And I think that the American press has forgotten that. They didn't originally. Right up past 48, the American papers were full of great reporting on the Middle East, and then it faded away.
Last question, and I'm sorry I forgot to read Sylvia Manukian's question. What is your opinion on using the term Armenocide as an alternate term for genocide or
Ridiculous.
Holocaust?
There is no legal definition in Armenocide. It's artificial name, also it sounds well, but we have material. It's also what we created, but there is no legal sense in the material. Armenian genocide is Armenian genocide because genocide is a legal term.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I appreciate your responses and your quick-fire responses. Can we give them one more? We are about to see a clip, Orphans of the Genocide.
And when League of Nations observers would go and visit these orphanages, they would see lists long list of names of Armenian kids, Armenian children's names, Asadur, Hagop, that we've crossed out and then replaced with Muslim names. And so they understood that there was a concerted, official, governmental process to change Armenian children into Muslim Turkish children.
The result of one of those concerted official governmental processes was the creation of Antura Orphanage, spearheaded by the commander of the 4th Ottoman Army, Ahmad Jamal Pasha.
What Jamal Pasha was doing in effect was killing the children's identity by turning them into Turks, taking away their culture, their religion, their very names. They were ceasing to exist as Armenians. Probably not as cheap as killing them, but mass killing in a place like Lebanon, where it was a little bit more public, would have been more difficult.
Antura, a small town nestled between the cornucopia of the Mediterranean turquoise and the verdant pine forests of Mount Lebanon, was once home to 1,000 Armenian genocide orphans destined for Turkification. Misak Kaleshian, a Silicon Valley electrical engineer, conducted thorough primary and secondary research and was able to conclude that the building currently used by the Antura Lazarite College in Lebanon was once under the Ottoman rule and a Turkification center for Armenian orphans.
According to Antura French College archives, there were 1,200 orphans, 200 of them being Kurds and Turks, and the rest Armenian children. Their ages between 3 to 14 years old.
In March of 2010, The Independent publishes an article penned by the award-winning British journalist Robert Fisk under the title of Living Proof of the Armenian Genocide. In that article, Mr. Fisk provides details of Mr. Kaleshian's findings. He describes how Mr. Kaleshian was able to trace a photo in a rare book called Lions of Marash, written by a Near East relief officer, Stanley Kerr.
This was the key element for my research, because I looked for the French College of Antura in Lebanon, and I did find the main entrance, and I was able to stand exactly at the same spot where Jamal Pasha stood. And it was an amazing discovery to find the exact location where in 1916, commander of the 4th Army in Syria, Jamal Pasha, with Halide Edip, the director of the college, were standing side by side. And here I am, standing at the same exact position.
What Misak did is he found a location and he found documents and he found photographs and he put them all together so it became a real, alive issue. What was so significant about it is that you could talk to people who knew where corpses of children were buried, who could actually go to the place where they were buried. You could see the church behind them. You could see the place where the Turks insisted that Boazin called morning prayer after Islamicizing the Christian college in Antura.
According to journals of the Lazarite Fathers found at the Antura orphanage, the Turkification process called for all male orphans to be circumcised. All the orphans were taught the Turkish language and cultural values in an effort to strip them of their true cultural identity.
Here again we see a picture right at the entrance with lots of Turkish flags, all the Turkish dignitaries with Halide Edip in the middle and Fauzi Bey on her left-hand side. We also see flowers in front of children, trying to portray that this orphanage was an excellent orphanage. As you can see, both sides of the picture, there are those arched windows, and right in the middle we can read 1898. And here it is today. The same spot with the same windows and the entrance door with the 1898 right on top of the arch.
Halide Edip Adibar, one of the most prominent women of the Ottoman era, was appointed the directress of the orphanage by Jamal Pasha.
Halide Edip narrates in her autobiography printed in 1926 that sometimes in the middle of the meal, when the children seemed happiest, one of the little ones would suddenly begin to cry. It was a screeching, cutting cry which lasted for hours, no doubt caused by some association with their home. Also, that one felt that these children, whatever happened, would carry something crippled, something mutilated in them.
Found in the library of Ontura College, including photos, handwritten documents, and memorabilia, prompted Mr. Eskijian to yet another discovery, the memoirs of Karnik Panian, one of the orphans at the Ontura orphanage.
You see, you can either kill a people, or you can totally take away their identity and inject them with a new one, which is what was happening at Ontura. And effectively you have killed them, because you've killed their race, you've killed their religion, you've killed their culture, you've killed their name. Of course, the children were treated so badly in Ontura that some of them died there. We know from actual survivors' accounts that some of the children were going and actually trying to grind up the bones of other dead children who died in the forest of hunger and eat what was left of the bones to try and stay alive. Almost a form of cannibalism. That shows what happened.
Karnik Panian, orphan number 551, was renamed Mahmud. He arrived at Ontura in 1916 at age 6.
When we were little, my sister and I, during dinner or lunchtime, when we didn't finish our food, my father used to say, "God will be unhappy with you." When I was a little boy in the orphanage, there were days when I was obliged to grind bones and eat bones in order to survive, sometimes grass. And he said, I didn't know if these bones were animal bones or the bones of my fellow orphans, because those who perished in that orphanage, they were thrown in a pit, and at night, animals used to come and eat their flesh.
In his memoirs, Mr. Panian writes, "At every sunset, in the presence of over 1,000 orphans, when the Turkish flag was lowered, 'Long live General Pasha' was recited. That was the first part of the ceremony.
And after that, it was time for punishing the children for what they have done, which was daring to speak Armenian or making any Christian references, say by crossing their heart or stealing food to eat. And all these acts were punishable by falakha. Falakha, which is a Turkish Ottoman way of punishment, by hitting the soul of the punished individual using an iron rod or a stick. They tied the feet of the victim to a stick which was held up by two individuals, and the third one would strike the souls of the victim using an iron rod to inflict maximum pain. In this case, the victims were children aged 3, 4, 5, and sometimes 10 years old, who would call for their dead mothers in unbearable pain.
Out of the 1,000 Armenian children at Antura orphanage, only 456 survived. Hundreds died as a result of deplorable conditions at the orphanage. The remains of over 300 orphans were discovered in 1993, when the Lazarite Fathers began construction for new classrooms. The remains found in the foundation of the college were moved to a mass grave on the grounds of the college cemetery, unmarked, carrying no epitaph. A special monument was erected at the Antura cemetery in memory of the 300 Armenian orphans. The monument is topped by a replica of the crown donned by the last Armenian king, Levon V. Underneath the crown lies the Cilician Armenian coat of arms, the roaring lion. It represents a symbolic posthumous inauguration, honoring the 300 Armenian genocide orphans as Armenian kings. Nearly 2,000 community members and dignitaries gathered for the inauguration of the site to pay respect for the souls of the 300 Armenian orphans. A special requiem service officiated the opening of the monument, followed by a special performance of Armenian liturgy by the Kohar Ensemble under the direction of Maestro Seifu Abkarian. Today, the Antura Monument is a pilgrimage site visited by thousands who travel from around the world to come and honor the memory of the orphaned Armenian children of Antura. They come to touch their epitaph and to feel their sorrow, giving voice to the silenced crime committed nearly 100 years ago and still left unrecognized.
Story about this film itself. It took us about 3.5 years to conclude this from the beginning till the end. And we had a lot of angels working with us to make this possible, from funders to actual people who worked on this. And some of them, most of them I should say, worked for nothing. It was a labor of love. What you saw was about 20 minutes of the film. The film is actually, the broadcast version is 90 minutes. It already aired on a number of PBS stations. And there's also the DVD version, which is 110 minutes, almost 2 hours long. When we were doing this research and finding all those stories about the orphans of the genocide, by the way, the reason we did this film is one big inspiration, and the inspiration was Dr. Robert Fisk's article that internationalized Misak Eskijian's finding. That's how we started, but we didn't stop there. And we went to we found and gathered different stories, and that's in the film. So having said that, what we found, we thought it's the tip of the iceberg, and there is a lot to be done. And we also found that we couldn't possibly fit everything in even 3 or 4 hour film, so we published a companion book with my co-author, Mrs. Maggie Gorshin. This is a familiar image. What we found, the footage, we found the footage for this shot. It's not only one single shot, it's a film. And those are very rare, as you heard, and we were able to locate this through the help of Dr. Demoyan and Misak Eskijian. We found this film at the German Bundesarchive, and we purchased only 3 minutes because that's how much we could afford. Another powerful image from the Gumri orphanage is this. These are orphan boys. This story is in the film, that they were knitting their socks for the upcoming Caucasian harsh winter. And they're not even girls, they're boys knitting socks. So imagine what they were going through. This is the orphan dress that you saw earlier, the unveiling happened. This was sort of a byproduct of the film that we made. I was lucky enough to meet individuals like Kevin Blowers and Rosemary Russell, who did a lot of research on this dress, and were able to bring it here. I'm very thankful to both. This lady, her name is Barbara Johnson. She comes from the famous Partridge family of Sivas, and what you see here is a chest, a jewelry chest made by orphans of Sivas, and it was donated to her family. She's an offspring of the Partridge family, and this chest is right there with the red cloth. And the way I found this is I was introduced to this lady by the Armenian Rag Association members, and they were able to bring this from San Francisco all the way here for you to see it today. Later on, I'll ask the representative of the Armenian Rag Society to unveil this. This is a detail of the handmade chest. What you didn't see is this lady's story, 105-year-old Alma Sabakian Bogosian, who told us our story. She passed away about a year ago actually, after we interviewed her. And one of her grandsons, incidentally, is the current president of the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. And it's worth mentioning that when we did the Gumri story, we had Dr. Demoyan interview. We interviewed him also, and he gave us an amazing story on the story of the Gumri orphanage. These are details of the vigil on April 23rd, 2011. We made a point of being in Yerevan and Tizenagapert specifically to film, to know intimately what happens during the commemoration of the genocide. And this gentleman, Jussi Fleming Bjorn, is, believe it or not, an Armenian, the son of an Armenian orphan. And I met him through Dr. Demoyan in Yerevan, and we interviewed him there, and he gave us an amazing story. He himself is a filmmaker, and he did a film about his grandmother who saved thousands of Armenian orphans. Of course, Dr. Eskijian, Dr. Hojhannes Eskijian, this compound is named after him. And he had an amazing story. We interviewed his daughter, Nancy, and incidentally, he was a Kesapzi from Kesap, and we all know what Kesap is what's going on in Kesap now. And his story is an amazing story too, and we featured it in there. As I said earlier, this program, this 90-minute version aired in a number of PBS stations, specifically 4 PBS stations so far. It was available to over 12 million viewers. We don't know if all of them watched it, but the numbers were great. The TV station, the PBS stations were very happy with the numbers. And my personal goal is, I hope we succeed in this. By 2015, make it available to 100 million through the airwaves of PBS. These are some, shots of the live broadcasting of the film. Now let me jump to my next project. The topic of the next project is called Women of 1915. It's partially on the plight of the Armenian women, but mostly on all those non-Armenian ladies who came to their rescue. So that's the main topic. That's the working title, Women of 1915. And right now we're in the midst of fundraising for that production. These are some of the awards that we've gotten for Orphans of the Genocide. And now, Women of 1915, I don't know how much time I'm left with. I can stop here. Time. Okay, then thank you for being here. And I would like to invite Ararat-Eskijian from the Armenian Rock Society to unveil that chest. Thank you very much. Thank you, Raj.
There it is. So this chest was made by orphans, and it's from Sepastia. So we have made it to the end of the day, and it was decided in organizing this conference that it was important not only to look at the history of humanitarian intervention during the Armenian Genocide, which we have done through looking at Near East Relief, looking at the Near East Foundation today, looking at the American Red Cross, looking at missionaries and their work, looking at how one film by one Armenian genocide survivor made headlines throughout the world. And finally, looking at the media coverage then and now, and how important it is to get the message out and how that message influences the way we think about politics now in our history. And we thought it was important to recognize the countries who did give aid back in 1915 and beyond. There are many more countries than you would suppose. They were all named in the first presentation, and I can't name them all, but they range from Latin America, from Brazil, to Australia, to Russia, to Japan, to almost all the countries in Europe, to America, to Canada. And I would like to invite Governor Dukmagin now to please come to the floor here to present the medals of appreciation to the diplomatic representatives who are here with us today. The medals of honor, where they have a special design, which you can read about in the pamphlet, the conference pamphlet. May I invite our diplomatic representatives from Norway, from Greece, and from Australia. Would you please come to the stage here?
Statue they're getting is Mother Armenia, and my father designed this when he was doing the museum and the church. And in the full statue that you see outside, and the Malikians provided the money to build it in bronze, the baby is larger than life for a reason, to survive. And so we're giving this out today as a memento of the museum, the history of the Armenians, and the survival of our culture and our people.
remarks that I have to make are very brief. They are not remarks that will provide you with any new information. I think that those of you who have been here listening to the distinguished speakers have certainly learned a great deal. I know I've learned quite a bit myself. Just briefly to tell you, my mother and father were wise enough to come to this country just before the genocide occurred because of the very ominous signs around them. They knew that there was big trouble heading their way. My mother used to tell us about her father, who was a merchant at the time, who was selling, as I recall, we would call them various types of materials that would be used to make other either costumes or dresses or suits or other things. And apparently as the situation was at that time, he would go out around the region trying to sell what he had in his business. But as she tells the story, he was beginning to help people to leave the area because he could tell what was coming. And the Turks apparently caught on to what he was doing. And so on this one occasion when he went out into the outer region of the area, and by the way, there's a little bit of confusion in my mind as to where my mother grew up. She always said she was Ararat, from Ararat. But she was born in Erzurum. Now don't ask me, I don't know. But she was always, all during the years that I was growing up, and it was just myself and my sister, she was always calling herself Ararat. And my father was from Aintab, so he was Aintab. Okay, so back to the story. Her father would go out into the region, and apparently he was helping some people to leave the area, and the Turks caught on, and some, I don't know, friendly Turk or somebody warned him. So when he left to go out on this sales trip, he didn't come back, and she didn't see him for about 4 or 5 years. He just went and never came back. And my mother had 2 sisters, and eventually, along with, I think, a son-in-law and so forth, eventually they made their way to the east coast of the United States. My father had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And one sister completely disappeared, and they never knew what happened to her. And my father, his 2 brothers, and his sister all eventually made it to the United States. And one brother and one sister eventually made it to Los Angeles. And my father eventually made it to Los Angeles. Both my mother and father both died here in Los Angeles. Now, having said that, I'm currently 85 years old, and I'm growing up as a young boy, as a young American boy in our village back east, and nobody knew who an Armenian was. Nobody. If you told anybody you were Armenian, they didn't have any idea what you were talking about. But we would stories from our parents, and accounts of what was going on and so forth. And I'm pleased to say that this conference that you've put together, and I want to commend the leaders of the Ararat home for doing this, has revealed to me that there were a number of organizations and a number of countries that tried to help as best they could with the plight of the Armenians. Because as I was growing up, the word and the impression that I gathered from my parents and their friends was that most of the major countries in the world just sort of, I would say, like turned their back on the Armenians, and they didn't get any help, and they had to individually find their way eventually to get here and so forth. That's another story. Now, when I became governor, I used to invite all of the consul generals who were assigned in Los Angeles area to 2 receptions. I should say 1 reception in the Southern California and 1 reception in Northern California. And I would always invite everybody, including the Turkish Consul General. And he did come on 1 or 2 occasions, but I think that when I said hello to him, it was kind of a cold, hello. It wasn't very warm compared to the others. And so my recollection is I think he came the first time and didn't come thereafter. And I was governor for 8 years, and so we had 8 of these. Every year we had 1. Now, anyway, that's just a little background. I have, from afar, I have always been a great admirer of Dr. Robert Fisk. I have read a number of his articles and reports and so forth over the years. And when I heard that he was going to be one of the participants in this conference today, I definitely did want to come to hear him. And I have always greatly admired him, and I continue to admire him and thank him for everything that he has done on behalf of the Armenians and making the world aware of the Armenian genocide. Now, having said all that, the real reason I'm here is because I was asked to come and present these beautiful awards to the participants. Awards are given in recognition and in appreciation of all the work that the participants and those who are going to receive these have done, and the efforts that have been made to help our parents and grandparents and all of the Armenians in this room to survive and to prosper. And so what the committee has done is they have commissioned these little statuettes, and the statuettes are a symbolic Mother Armenia Award symbolizing the revival and the return of the Armenian people. Now, little did the Turks know that when my mother and father left Armenia, that their son would wind up as governor of California. I'm sure they didn't really care one way or the other. But those of you who are here and so many others in the community have demonstrated that despite the very difficulties that our parents and grandparents experienced, that they were able to convey to their children and grandchildren many important values that they indicated would serve us well as we were growing up so I am the beneficiary of that. And when I see some of the pictures and listen to the comments that have been made, I constantly say to myself, thank goodness that, there, but for the grace of God go I could have been one of the young orphans left there. Anyway, I won't prolong this. This has already been a long day for everybody. Yeah, so what they're going to say. So the first person who's going to receive this is a representative from the country of Greece, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to present this to you and to thank you for participating in this event.
Assistant Consul General of Greece, and Karen Lanyon, Consulate General of Australia. Thank you very much.